Studies of children's welfare in the past have traditionally told the story of what institutions did to children in their care, drawing attention to the discipline, control, and power that vulnerable children were subjected to. Children in residential care have too often been presented as passive agents, victims of trauma, abuse, and exploitation at the hands of institutional staff, whose voices are rarely heard, personal experiences are little documented, and whose feelings and emotions are rarely articulated. Emerging research, however, is beginning to overturn this dominant narrative through consideration of children's experiences and feelings, and by looking at their individual histories and trajectories. Research is, for example, beginning to reconstruct full life stories of children in care, rather than focusing solely on their period of institutionalisation, in order to better understand their experiences and the impacts of care on their everyday lives. The digitisation of sources has enabled scholars to undertake sophisticated types of record linkage and genealogical work more easily than ever before. There is also perennial interest among the public in this type of history, which affords new opportunities to undertake research with care experienced individuals and their ancestors. Meanwhile, innovative frameworks and approaches can bring new questions to surviving sources. The material and affective turns, for example, offer new opportunities for scholars to re-evaluate histories of welfare, institutionalisation, and social care that place greater emphasis on the views, voices, feelings, and experiences of actors who have hitherto been obscured. In the broader field of childhood and youth studies, there has been a recent refocus on the concept of agency, perhaps best seen in the recent issue in the American Historical Review, where lively debate has taken place about its methodological use and value in interpreting histories of childhood in the past. The concept of agency poses distinct challenges for the study of children's welfare, and as such, this has led me, like many others here, to reconsider whether the concept hinders or enhances our inquiry. When faced with a problematically produced institutional archive, too often interpretations of children's agency come to rest on instances of rebellion, where children have resisted institutional rules and authority, have spoken up and spoken out either verbally or through their actions, and suffered the consequences. More often than not, they've been punished. Thus, running away, destruction of institutional property, resistance to fulfilling institutional expectations, breaking the rules, and many other instances can all be read as children exercising their agency within the constraints of their particular context. Other forms of agency exist and are more subtle in the archive. These are the processes of cooperation and collaboration. We can at times glimpse the ways in which children bought into institutional authority, how they followed the rules without question, instances of obedience, and how they worked hard to prove themselves a credit to their training. But of course, there are problems with the exercise of agency. Who has the power, the ability, the confidence, and the privilege to be agentic in different forms? And very often, this ability is linked to gender, age, class, race, and other facets of individuals' background and identity. As such, if we're not careful, many other individuals get lost along the way. Their silence in the archive can be overlooked as being unworthy of scrutiny, while we inflate the value of these agentic actions and their actors. Another recent and stimulating conference pondered whether the concept of agency could be replaced by or subsumed in a new methodology or approach labelled the history of experiences, which seeks to help close the gap between structures, ideology, and individual agency. Although the history of experience is not a new approach, I do support the notion that a focus on experience rather than agency can be more fruitful. In my own work, I've sought to move beyond agency as a safety argument, as Lynn Thomas calls it, or an end goal, and rather my work has drawn heavily on tools from microhistory, the history of everyday life approaches, and the history of emotions to focus on the experiences of the marginalised. I've borrowed from the material and the effective to study the complex structure and feel of these lives, to understand the mentalities of these individuals, their resilience in the face of change, the power and misfortune that shaped their lives, and how they understood and gave meaning to their experiences. I've grappled with their values, feelings, and belief systems in order to examine the more personal and intimate aspects of their lives. So this paper draws on a much larger project currently funded by the British Academy that examines emotions and experiences of poor families that engaged with state and voluntary welfare agencies across the 19th and 20th centuries in Britain, Australia, and Canada. In this paper, I'm going to look at a single case study, that of Ernest Simmons, who was admitted to the Waifs and Strays Society, which was the second largest children's welfare institution operating in Britain in the late 19th century. In doing so, the paper seeks to build a case for why a focus on experience and emotion rather than simply agency matters, and how such a focus might illuminate some of the grander issues at play in historical inquiry about children, family, and welfare. And if you're particularly interested in reading more about my work on the British welfare system, this case file is examined along with about 1,000 others in my forthcoming book, which is called A Home from Home, Children and Social Care in Victorian and Edwardian Britain, 1870 to 1920, which will be published soon with Oxford University Press. So Ernest Simmons was born on the 9th of August 1883 in Beccles, Suffolk. His mother Catherine, a fishhawker, next to nothing. Unmarried and receiving no financial help from Ernest's father, she struggled to make ends meet. How Ernest and his mother lived for the first 6 years of his life is relatively unknown. He had attended infant school irregularly and entered the workhouse twice for short periods. His health was good, but he was blind in one eye. But with the arrival of a second illegitimate child born in 1889 to the mother, Reverend Rousell, the rector of Beccles, intervened in the family's plight to survive. He wrote to the Waifs and Strays Society to remove Ernest from his mother's care, describing the case as really one of the worst that could be found anywhere. Ernest was destitute, wretched and deplorable as regards food, clothing and home. His moral position was a highly unsatisfactory one. The 4-week-old infant boy was considered too young to be parted from his mother, and there's no indication that he was ever surrendered to the society at a later date. The society's secretary for Norwich, Edward Dowson, and Jane Cholmondeley, the rector's wife in the nearby parish of Carlton Road, worked together to arrange that Ernest be placed with foster parents Anne and Henry Pegnall, a farming family with no children of their own in Carlton Road. What terms and conditions Ernest's mother believed she was agreeing to in parting with her child are unknown. If Ernest's mother was literate, she did not sign or make her mark on the application papers filled out by Reverend Rousell. A later letter intimates that Mary Crowfoot, a respected local philanthropist in Beccles, had told Catherine Simmons that if she ceased her evil ways, reformed her character and remained steady, she would be allowed to take charge of Ernest once again. But a foreboding letter sent from Jane Cholmondeley to Edward Dowson 3 years later warned that the expected trouble has come. The letter related that Mrs. Simmons had arrived unexpectedly at the school playground to see Ernest. She appeared to be in better circumstances. A sum of £20 paid to her on her uncle's death meant she now possessed a furnished room in a nice house. Moreover, she was respectably dressed and soon going to be married. Mrs. Simmons believed that she had fulfilled her end of the bargain to warrant Ernest's return home. But Ernest felt differently. Aged 9, he responded to his mother's surprise reappearance not with excitement or delight, but rather with fright. Mary Crowfoot wrote that Mrs. Simmons was now fearful that she would lose Ernest's affection entirely unless she had him home with her again. Determined to have him back in her care, Mrs. Simmons mounted her campaign. She threatened to bring 3 witnesses forward who would be able to prove that Ernest was taken against her will and to go to the law to have him restored to her care. While the Society's affiliates and agents were convinced that Mrs. Simmons was still living a dissolute life, they acknowledged their weak position. They had no written consent from Ernest's mother handing over his care to the Society, and they had no power without justices to detain the child. Their only power was to detain Ernest's clothing, which were the property of the Society and the foster parents. Mr. Dowson queried whether the Custody of Children Act 1891 might be applied to the case if the mother could be deemed unfit. But the local policeman, who had been charged with watching Mrs. Simmons, had found no cause of complaint against her. An order arrived on the morning of Saturday, 16th of April, from the Society to return Ernest to his mother's care that afternoon. But with it came a blinding snowfall, which made his return over the Easter weekend quite impossible. Moreover, Henry Pegnall firmly refused to hand over Ernest without a week's notice. A letter stated that the old man says he loves the boy as if he were his own and would gladly keep him for nothing if he could afford it, and no person on earth shall make him send him away from his home. It is most touching to see their affection. After a week of stormy difficulties, Ernest left his foster parents on Saturday, the 23rd of April, and it was hoped that the mother might make the poor boy a happy home. It was unlikely that Ernest did find a happy home in his mother's care. He was received back by his foster parents for a visit over the harvest later that year, having spent only a few short summer months with his mother. The details regarding this arrangement have not survived, and so the reason for his visit remains obscured. A letter from Edward Dowson suggested that his mother had changed her mind about keeping Ernest and now did not want him back. Ernest was changed by the experience too. When he returned home to the Pegnalls, he was described as being like one dazed or drugged, quite altered from the happy child he was when living with the Pegnalls. But he slowly recovered, and as he did, he retold some of his sad experiences with his mother to Mrs. Pegnall. He had been witness to regular gambling, drunkenness, and prostitution. He was described as being in terror lest he should be sent back, and it has been piteous to see him cry for joy and cling to Mrs. Pegnall each time I have brought him a month's reprieve through the kindness of friends. Ernest remained with his foster parents, despite his mother's further attempts to get him back home, which ceased after Ernest wrote himself to say that he had no wish to come home to her. In August 1897, when Ernest was 14, he started work with a bricklayer, but continued to reside with his foster parents, presumably beginning to contribute to their household. 3 years later, his mother, who remained living a single life in Beccles, died. Whether Ernest ever saw his mother again after his brief return home to her remains unclear. There's no indication in his case file that she visited him, and no letters survived between Ernest and his mother were subsequently sequestered by the Society. Although Ernest did have relatives who outlived his mother, including his grandfather and several aunts and uncles, he remained with his foster parents. In 1911, an update described him as an exemplary young man in the parish and still so good to his foster mother. Henry Pegnall had died in 1908, and in 1911, 27-year-old Ernest was listed as the only other occupant of the Pegnall family home. He'd remained living with the 77-year-old widow Anne following her husband's death, and he'd continued to support his pensioner foster mother and the household through his labouring work. Like many other case records, Ernest's story provides an excellent example of several instances where he was able to exercise his agency within the confines of the powers that structured his life, while also revealing the limits of his power in being buffeted about between foster family and his mother with very little say. But in order to better understand these actions, experiences, and the meanings assigned to them, these instances must be read in conjunction with his broader life history and experience while in foster care and beyond. They must also be read alongside the power structures at play that shape not only his life, but the lives of the many other individuals involved in his care. By doing so, we can better grasp the context in which decisions to act, behave, to respond, and feel in specific ways, whether conscious or unconscious, might have been made. His story of residential care in the Waifs and Strays Society demonstrates a number of complexities and tensions faced by parents, institutional officials, and often children themselves. His case highlights first the issues faced by welfare agencies in seeking to rescue children deemed to be at risk of neglect or in danger, and attempts to provide them with consistent quality care. Although legislation introduced in the second half of the 19th century gave greater powers to the state and voluntary welfare bodies to intervene in family life in order to protect children, the power to detain and commit children given to voluntary welfare institutions was limited. It was not until the introduction of legislation in 1926 that made the adoption process legal for the first time and enabled the permanent transfer of orphans and illegitimate children to new parents. While the Waifs and Strays, like many other state and voluntary agencies, participated in and facilitated various forms of unregulated adoption, parents still retained the ultimate legal responsibility for their children. Parents were often knowledgeable about their rights over children, even if, like Mrs. Simmons, they were unable to comprehend or agree to the terms and conditions imposed by welfare agencies. But Catherine Simmons did seem to know or intuitively feel this, and it profoundly shaped the steps she took to ensure her son returned to her. The threats she made to involve the law in reclaiming her son indicate that she was confident that she had not irrevocably transferred her rights to Ernest to another party, and was well informed about the resources and powers she could call upon in her campaign. It also meant that welfare institutions often found themselves powerless should children's relatives later fight for the return of children's custody. Despite wishing to invoke legal assistance to detain Ernest, the institution's reaction to Catherine's campaign for Ernest's return home was wholly influenced by their recognition of their powerlessness. The case also demonstrates the significance that welfare officials placed on providing permanency of home and family to children in their care. Children's stability, upheld by the institution as an ideal, could be threatened by parents' demands for children's return. As such, the case also suggests the importance of bureaucracy and paperwork in the processes of rescuing, removing, and providing support to children. These contracts and agreements could help to shape how permanent a child's placement was in reality. Practices of fostering and adoption were largely unregulated, non-standardized, and relatively informal at this time, and as Ernest's case shows, the society's agents were satisfied in admitting him to their care with only the supposed verbal consent of his mother. Although the Pecknells were required to sign a form of binding to the society's terms regarding fostering, the society's agents were not as methodical or rigorous in obtaining written consent from the individual that mattered the most in this case, his mother. Institutional agents used such documents to remind parents of the terms they'd agreed to discourage demands for their return, or as evidence that might stand up to legal scrutiny. It's likely that the reassurance supposedly issued to Catherine Simmons by Mary Crowfoot that if she reformed her character, she could take charge of Ernest once again, affected not only Catherine's understanding of the terms by which she was surrendering her child to care, but also the expectations she had to fulfill in order to become a mother to him once again. Mary Crowfoot's involvement in the case, no matter how well-meaning she intended to be, had a huge impact on the experiences of Ernest, his mother, his foster parents, and the Waifs and Strays staff. She was unaffiliated with the society and seemingly unaware of the institution's processes, which consequently shaped the engagements between Catherine Simmons and the society. Ernest's case also demonstrates the subjective, non-standardised and non-scientific assessments that poor and working class families were subjected to. Many individuals were associated in providing testimony, opinion, and views on the Simmons' circumstances and character, including Ernest's mother's ability to care for him. Some of these individuals were directly associated with the society as paid members of staff, with distinct and prescribed roles, while others, like Mary Crowfoot, were simply interested, concerned members of the local community. Individuals who often had considerable wealth, power, and respect. However attentive and involved these individuals might be, their evaluations of family circumstances and character were not only subjective, but often based on hearsay, inaccuracies, and misunderstandings. More often than not, these assessments betrayed these individuals' own anxieties and prejudices. In addition, assessments of working class and poor families were measured against middle class ideals about home and family, and as such, these families always fell short in their attempt to maintain a comfortable and loving home for their children. It's unlikely that Mrs. Simmons, who continued to struggle to keep the wolf from her door, and who, by virtue of having fallen twice by having two illegitimate children, would ever be able to redeem herself as a respectable mother in the eyes of either the society's agents or influential middle-class philanthropists like Mary Crowfoot. Finally, the case shows that ideas of family were complex for children in care. Being able to provide a child with a sense of loving family life that was superior from that which children were rescued from was one of the society's key objectives. If the particulars of Ernest's case are to be believed, Ernest and his foster parents developed strong bonds of attachment, demonstrated by the foster parents' grief and objection to his return back to his mother. Despite their lowly status, socially, as a rural farming family, reliant on the income provided by the society through their fostering, they felt strongly enough about Ernest to once again offer him a home during the harvest of 1892, despite the possibility that it would not only be a temporary sort of situation, but also one that was fraught with difficulty and trouble from Ernest's mother. Ernest too must have felt a similar strength of feeling about the Pegnalls. While his mother struck fear in him, the image of him clinging to his foster mother suggests that he felt a deep attachment to her. He was an active agent, therefore, in imagining and constructing his own family. When he was older, he took steps to cut off ties with his biological mother, wanting never again to see her. His choice to remain with his foster mother until at least the age of 27 confirms his devotion and affection for this family. This paper has used a single case study to argue for a greater and more detailed focus on the experience and emotion of children, of welfare recipients, to move beyond simply highlighting agentic behaviour that challenged or cooperated with institutional and political power. Instead, by focusing on experience and inherently the emotions and feelings that structured the circumstances that these individuals encountered, we can begin to see the undulation of power between different actors, the motivations and meanings of specific actions, the shifting dynamics of individual relationships, facets of character and personality, and the behaviours and experiences to the circumstances that these individuals encountered in different times and places. Moreover, this focus helps us in our attempts to reconstruct the social, political, economic, and emotional context in which particular actions were made. We can better comprehend the options available to these actors and how they navigated, negotiated, and envisioned their relationship with others that affected how they might meet their own ends. By seeking to understand actors' responses and feelings, we may also begin to comprehend how they understood and exercised agency, and how agency might be entangled with other internal or external processes and shaped by the unique possibilities and constraints of individual contexts. Thank you.